I'll be your slave if you draw it." The words came from billionaire Edward Blackwell, his voice smooth with arrogance as laughter rippled through the golden penthouse. Cameras were already rolling. A maid had dared to look too long at his prized painting, and now she was the evening's entertainment. The crowd watched as Grace, her uniform stained from spilled champagne, slowly lifted her gaze toward the challenge. Her trembling hands reached for the pencil he tossed at her feet. The room buzzed with cruel amusement, no one expecting what was about to unfold. Because sometimes, humiliation is just the spark before revelation. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The night glittered like a crown placed upon the city's highest tower. From miles away, Edward Blackwell's penthouse shimmered like a beacon of luxury, a palace of glass and gold perched above the world it overlooked. Inside, laughter flowed like music, blending with the faint echo of violins and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. Everything gleamed, the marble floors polished to perfection, the chandeliers heavy with light, the air perfumed with money and pride. Edward stood at the center of it all, tall, handsome in a way that came from tailored suits and self-importance. His smile was confident, his voice smooth, and his every gesture designed to command admiration. He was a man accustomed to control, of people, of wealth, of attention. And tonight, he had all three. He was surrounded by guests, men in tailored tuxedos and women draped in silk and diamonds, all eager to be near his orbit. The champagne flowed freely, laughter louder with every pour. But beneath the celebration lay a subtle tension, the kind that exists when wealth and ego share the same room. Edward lifted his glass and nodded toward the massive painting displayed on the far wall. It was draped in soft amber light, commanding the attention of all who entered. "Now this," he said, smiling, "is what separates vision from mediocrity. A piece of pure genius, imported from Europe, no less. $1 million well spent." The crowd applauded politely. Some nodded with feigned appreciation, others simply followed his lead, not daring to admit they didn't understand what made it special. Among the laughter and chatter moved Grace Thompson, her presence so quiet it was almost invisible. Dressed in a crisp maid's uniform, she moved gracefully between the guests, refilling glasses and collecting empty plates. Her posture was upright, her movements measured, the practiced rhythm of a woman who had spent years in service, learning the art of dignity in silence. Her hands, though aged and calloused, worked with a kind of grace that made them beautiful. They told a story, of struggle, of endurance, of a lifetime spent cleaning up the traces of other people's glory. The guests barely noticed her. She was part of the background, like the marble or the music, there to make everything else shine. But Grace noticed everything. She noticed the women's laughter, high-pitched and rehearsed. She noticed the men's polished arrogance, the way they spoke about the world as if it were theirs to shape. And she noticed Edward most of all, the way he soaked in admiration like a man who could never get enough of himself. Then, as she passed near the grand wall where the unveiled painting hung, her steps slowed. Her gaze lifted. The painting was exquisite, soft brushstrokes melting into each other, light and sorrow woven together in quiet brilliance. It was a portrait of a woman, her eyes distant but alive, her expression tender and haunting all at once. Grace felt something stir inside her, something long buried. Her breath caught. She knew those brushstrokes. The way the colors bled into one another, the gentle shaping of the eyes, the fine details around the lips, it wasn't just familiar. It was hers. Her heart thudded once, hard. She blinked, almost disbelieving. It couldn't be. That painting had vanished years ago, sold under desperate circumstances, her name erased, her signature hidden beneath layers of new varnish. But there it was, shining in a billionaire's penthouse as if it belonged to him. Grace's fingers tightened around the silver tray she held. She stepped back, steadying her breath. No one noticed the shift in her expression, the faint tremor of her lips. She forced herself to move, to blend back into the rhythm of service. But inside, her soul trembled. At that moment, Edward's voice broke through her thoughts like a blade. "Careful, Grace," he called out, smirking as the nearby guests turned toward her. "Don't get too close. That canvas has seen more culture than you ever will." The laughter came immediately, loud, cruel, effortless. Grace lowered her eyes, hiding the storm behind them. "Yes, sir," she said softly. Edward chuckled, pleased with his own wit. You see, he told his guests, art has a way of separating those who appreciate it from those who simply dust it. The crowd laughed again, and Grace turned away, her expression unreadable. She walked back toward the catering table, her steps measured, her dignity intact. Inside, however, the ache had turned into something deeper, a slow burn of disbelief and sorrow. How easily they mocked what they didn't understand. How easily they dismissed the hands that had built the world they flaunted. For a brief moment, Grace allowed herself to glance once more at the painting. Beneath the soft glow of the chandelier, the woman in the portrait seemed to look back at her, not as a stranger, but as a reflection. Her reflection. The laughter continued. Edward was now recounting how he'd secured the deal to purchase the painting, boasting about his eye for rare art and his refined taste. The guests clapped and murmured their admiration. He raised his glass in mock humility. Some people collect memories, he said smugly. I collect history. Grace's heart twisted at the irony. The history he spoke of, the beauty he claimed to own, was hers. A piece of her soul, stripped of credit, framed in gold, and turned into his status symbol. She exhaled slowly, setting her tray down for a moment to still her trembling hands. Years of silence pressed on her chest, the weight of everything she had endured, the nights painting by candlelight, the sacrifices made to survive, the dreams left behind to care for a dying parent. And now, here it was. The very work that had once defined her, stolen, renamed, and worshipped by the same kind of man who would never believe she was capable of creating it. She looked around the glittering room one last time, the laughter, the arrogance, the ease of cruelty disguised as charm. Then she straightened her back. No one noticed. No one ever did. But the woman they mocked tonight, the maid they barely saw, had once held a brush steadier than any artist Edward could ever hope to meet. And as she turned away from the laughter, the truth shimmered quietly in the air, unseen, unspoken, but alive. Grace Thompson was staring at her own creation, hanging proudly on a wall owned by a man who thought he understood art. He didn't know it yet, but the night he chose to humiliate her would be the night the world began to remember her name. The hour grew later, and with it, the room grew louder, laughter bouncing from one glass wall to the next, blending with the notes of the string quartet and the clinking of champagne flutes. Pride had become the main course of the evening. Edward Blackwell stood at its center, radiant in his self-importance, surrounded by guests who fed on his confidence like it was wine itself. The golden penthouse shimmered with excess, diamonds glinting on wrists, polished shoes reflecting chandelier light, voices dripping with privilege. Edward thrived in it, his laughter booming, his charm rehearsed. His guests adored him, not because they liked him, but because his approval made them feel closer to power. And through it all, Grace Thompson moved silently, an old rhythm guiding her steps, her years of experience folding seamlessly into the night. She collected empty glasses, replaced napkins, and ensured the floor stayed spotless under the crowd's careless feet. Her back ached, her hands ached, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Every time her eyes passed over the painting, that quiet fire inside her grew stronger. She couldn't forget the way Edward had mocked her earlier. It had been a lifetime since anyone had spoken to her like that, yet tonight, humiliation had been dressed as entertainment. Then it happened. A young woman, tipsy from too much champagne, leaned too close to the table. Her glass slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the floor, its red contents splattering across the marble and near the base of the painting. "Oh no," she gasped, laughing nervously, "I'm so clumsy." Grace was already moving before anyone else reacted. Her instincts, years of service compressed into habit, kicked in. She knelt down quickly, pressing a towel to the spreading stain. The cold liquid seeped through the fabric and into her skin, but she didn't mind. She'd done this 1,000 times. The guests barely noticed, continuing their conversations. Only Edward watched, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to amusement as her elbow brushed against the painting's frame. It tilted slightly to one side, just enough to draw gasps from the crowd. Edward turned sharply. His jaw tightened. "Watch it, Grace," he said, his voice cold as stone. "That painting's worth more than your entire life's work." A hush fell, followed by a ripple of laughter. Phones rose. Someone whispered, "He's filming this." Another giggled. "Oh, this is going online for sure." Grace steadied the frame with both hands, her heart beating in her throat. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, her tone steady but low. But Edward wasn't satisfied. The attention was intoxicating, and cruelty had become his wine. "You should be," he continued, smirking as cameras flashed. "Tell me, Grace, what do you know about art?" The room laughed again. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "For someone like you, beauty must mean a clean floor and a good mop." The laughter turned louder, sharper, no longer the laughter of amusement, but the kind that feeds on someone else's discomfort. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't let go of her calm. Her face remained neutral, her eyes lowered, though not from shame. Inside her, something shifted, something deep and familiar. A fire that age hadn't dimmed, only buried. Edward, loving every second, continued. "You know," he said to his audience, "maybe we should make this interesting. If she thinks she understands art, maybe she should prove it." Grace looked up then, her eyes meeting his. The room stilled for a heartbeat. Edward smirked. "Here's my offer, Grace. Draw something close to this painting, right here, right now, and I'll be your slave for a week." Laughter exploded through the room. Champagne sloshed over glasses as guests leaned in, eager to watch the spectacle. Some clapped, others jeered softly, enjoying the absurdity of it. Grace said nothing. Her gaze didn't waver. She simply stood there, straight and still, the crowd's laughter washing over her like wine through trees. After a long silence, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but strong. "If that's what you want," she said, "bring me a pencil." The laughter faltered. Even the quartet stopped playing. Edward blinked. "You're serious?" Her reply was calm. "You made a promise. I'll hold you to it." The crowd exchanged looks, half nervous, half thrilled. No one moved for a moment, until Edward, smirking again, gestured toward one of the staff. "Well, someone bring our artist her tools. Let's see what she can do." The servant hesitated before fetching a notepad and a pencil from the reception counter. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the items were placed in Grace's hands. Her fingers, roughened by years of labor, brushed lightly over the pencil's surface. It felt foreign, yet familiar. Like meeting an old friend after decades apart. She knelt again, this time not to clean, but to create. The paper lay before her on the floor, the chandelier's light glinting off her silver-streaked hair. The crowd gathered around her in a loose circle, their phones ready, their curiosity replacing cruelty, at least for now. Grace took a deep breath. Her eyes lifted briefly toward the painting, the same painting that had stolen her name. The colors burned into her mind, every shade, every emotion. She blinked once, lowered her gaze, and began. The first line was shaky. Her hand trembled, the pencil slipping slightly. Someone chuckled. "She's too old for this," a man whispered. But Grace didn't stop. The second line came steadier, then the third. Her wrist loosened, her breathing deepened. The rhythm returned, a rhythm older than her pain, older than her servitude. Her hand moved like a conductor's, sketching emotion into form. The graphite whispered against the paper, a quiet defiance in every stroke. The crowd fell silent. No one laughed now. Even Edward found himself staring, the arrogance slowly draining from his face. There was something in the way she moved, something unteachable, something that could not be faked. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Her hands danced with certainty, filling the page with light and shadow, life and sorrow. She didn't look up, not once. When she finished, she set the pencil down gently, her chest rising and falling in quiet rhythm. The room was utterly still. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Before them lay a perfect reflection, the same woman, the same depth, the same soul, drawn from memory by the maid they had mocked. Edward swallowed hard, forcing a strained laugh. "Well, impressive for a cleaning lady," he said, but his voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. Grace rose slowly, her knees stiff, her expression calm. "You asked me to draw," she said quietly. "Now you've seen it." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. The laughter had died, replaced by a quiet understanding that something extraordinary had just happened. Grace's eyes drifted back to the painting. The night wasn't over, not yet. What she would do next would turn that golden penthouse into a courtroom, and Edward Blackwell's pride into his undoing. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Only the faint hum of the chandelier filled the silence as Grace Thompson, the maid they had mocked moments ago, steadied the pencil in her trembling fingers. Her knuckles were rough, her veins visible beneath the thin skin of her hands that had once held brushes, not brooms. She pressed the pencil gently against the paper, and the first line appeared, faint, unsure, like the echo of a memory struggling to be reborn. Then another line followed. And another. The crowd, once alive with laughter and snide remarks, fell silent. Conversations froze. Glasses hung midair. The music stopped entirely, the quartet lowering their instruments one by one as curiosity turned to awe. Grace's movements began to change. The hesitation that marked her first strokes melted into fluid grace, rhythm replacing fear. It was as if her body remembered something her life had forced her to forget. Her wrist curved effortlessly, tracing the shadows of emotion, capturing the faint tilt of the woman's face, the sorrow resting beneath her painted eyes. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in years, she felt whole again. The guests leaned closer. Phones that had moments ago been lifted to mock her now hung forgotten in idle hands. They could hear the sound of the pencil gliding, a soft, whispering rhythm that filled the room with an intimacy words couldn't reach. Grace didn't look up once. Her eyes followed the movement of the pencil as though guided by something unseen. The graphite danced across the white page, building form out of emptiness, life out of silence. Every stroke carried a piece of her story, the late nights she'd spent painting under a dim lamp before bills and sickness had stolen her dreams, the brushes she'd pawned to afford medicine, the canvases she'd burned for warmth. Now, under the cold gaze of the rich, that same fire burned again, not in bitterness but in purpose. Minutes stretched into eternity. Edward Blackwell, who had begun this game with a smirk, now stood motionless. His confidence had slipped, replaced by an unease he didn't understand. He glanced at the guests around him, expecting someone to laugh again, to say something to break the spell, but no one did. Grace's hand moved faster, sure and deliberate. Her line softened, then sharpened, capturing every fragile detail, the sadness in the eyes of the woman from the painting, the light falling across her cheek, the almost hidden hope beneath the surface. The graphite deepened into shading. Shadow met light. Form met soul. When she finally paused, the only sound in the room was the faint tick of the clock. She stared at her work for a moment, not to judge it, but to breathe it in. Then she set the pencil down with quiet finality. Slowly, she stood. The paper in front of her glowed with life. It was not a sketch, it was resurrection. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The likeness was perfect. The same sorrow. The same grace. The same humanity. One guest whispered, "It's identical." Edward's throat tightened. He forced out a chuckle, brittle and uncertain. "A coincidence," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "A good copy, that's all. She's probably seen the painting before." No one laughed. Grace looked at him, not angry, not triumphant, simply tired. She wiped her hands on her apron, a quiet gesture of closure, and then turned toward the real painting hanging on the wall. Edward's voice snapped through the air. "Don't touch that." She ignored him. Her steps were slow, deliberate. Every eye followed her. When she reached the painting, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the same soft napkin she'd used to clean the spill earlier. Then, with gentle precision, she began to wipe the bottom corner of the frame. The guests murmured in confusion, and then, as the layer of polish lifted away, a collective gasp filled the room. Beneath the golden glow, beneath years of concealment, faint but unmistakable, two letters shimmered into view: G. Thompson. The sound that followed was not laughter, it was the heavy silence of revelation. Edward froze where he stood. His smirk collapsed. His hand lowered, glass trembling slightly. The crowd erupted in hushed whispers. "She painted it," someone said. Another voice echoed, "It's her signature." Edward's mind raced, his face pale. No, that can't be right." Grace turned toward him. Her gaze was steady, her voice calm. "You said you'd be my slave if I could draw it," she said quietly. "But you've been a slave all along, to pride." Her words fell like a verdict. The weight of them hung in the air, pressing on every corner of that golden room. The laughter, the arrogance, the cruelty, all of it dissolved into the silence that followed. For the first time, Edward had nothing to say. His wealth, his charm, his social power, none of it mattered now. Every guest could see the truth written plainly before them. The maid they had laughed at was the artist they had admired. Grace placed the napkin neatly on the counter beside the sketch and turned away. She didn't demand credit. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked toward the elevator, her posture straight, her steps steady. The crowd parted for her without a word. As the elevator doors closed, the last thing anyone saw was her hand, the same hand that had drawn brilliance, polished their silver, and restored her dignity, still holding the pencil, warm from creation. Behind her, the penthouse was no longer filled with laughter. Only murmurs remained, the uncomfortable sound of realization. Edward Blackwell stood alone, staring at the painting that had once made him proud. But now, every time he looked at it, he saw her, the woman he'd mocked, the artist he'd stolen from, the truth he could never erase. Outside, Grace stepped into the cool night air. The city lights flickered below, vast and endless. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight lift from her chest. For the first time in years, her name, her real name, had been spoken aloud. She didn't need applause. She didn't need revenge. She had given them truth, and the truth, once revealed, could never be painted over again. Grace walked down the quiet street, the pencil still in her hand, her heart steady. The night that had begun with humiliation had ended with revelation. And the woman they had mocked had reminded the world that greatness doesn't fade, it only waits to be seen again. The night after the humiliation, the world began to turn in ways no one in that glittering penthouse could have imagined. While Edward Blackwell and his guests tried to sleep off the taste of champagne and embarrassment, the internet had already decided the truth would not be silenced. By morning, the video was everywhere. Billionaire humiliates Maid, instantly regrets it. The title blazed across social media feeds like a storm. Millions clicked. Millions watched. Millions shared. In the clip, the camera shook slightly, but the story was clear. A rich man mocking an older maid for daring to look at his painting. And that same maid, quiet and composed, revealing the stolen truth hidden beneath the layers of varnish and pride. The world stopped scrolling to watch Grace Thompson lift the mask off power. Within hours, news anchors replayed the moment on every major network. "A billionaire's art world exposed," said one headline. "The maid who painted the masterpiece," declared another. Talk shows dissected it, morning hosts praised her dignity, and art critics across continents called it the greatest accidental art revelation of the century. And at the center of it all was a woman who had never asked for fame, Grace Thompson, the forgotten artist. She woke up that morning in her small apartment, unaware of the digital storm surrounding her. Her phone buzzed endlessly, calls, messages, notifications. Her neighbor knocked on her door, breathless, holding up a tablet. "Grace," she said, eyes wide, "you're on the news." Grace took the tablet and stared. There she was, kneeling on the marble floor of Edward Blackwell's penthouse, sketching beneath a chandelier, her face calm, her hand steady, while laughter filled the room. Then the moment when she wiped the frame, and the initials appeared. Her name. G. Thompson. It was no longer hidden. Grace sat down slowly, the world spinning around her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't proud. She simply felt still, as if the truth had finally breathed after years of suffocation. Across the city, Edward Blackwell's world was falling apart. Reporters camped outside his gates. Investors pulled their money. Art galleries issued statements distancing themselves from his name. His social media accounts filled with fury, hashtags demanding justice, apology, accountability. And the art world smelled blood. Journalists began digging into his past acquisitions, tracing every deal, every collection. What they found shocked even his closest allies. Dozens of rare paintings in his possession had murky origins, artists unpaid, credits erased, signatures covered by paint. Grace's discovery had opened a vault of deceit, and the world was watching. Within days, his empire, once built on charm and prestige, began to collapse. Meanwhile, Grace received invitation after invitation, art foundations, galleries, television networks. They wanted her story. They wanted her presence. They wanted to hear from the maid who turned humiliation into history. For years, she had lived unseen. Now, every camera wanted her light. She accepted only a few, the ones that felt sincere. When she sat for her first interview, the world saw not bitterness, but serenity. The host leaned forward, trying to coax emotion. "Grace," she asked gently, "what went through your mind when he mocked you in front of everyone?" Grace smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes soft. "I've been mocked before," she said. "But I've also learned that dignity doesn't need permission to exist." The audience clapped softly. Another interviewer asked, "Do you hate Edward Blackwell for what he did to you?" Grace paused, her gaze thoughtful. "Hate," she repeated quietly. "No. That would make me a prisoner too." The studio fell silent. "I wish him peace," she said finally. "Forgiveness is freedom. I gave my art to the world, not to him." Those words rippled across the internet. They were shared, quoted, printed on posters. People wrote them on signs, shared them in videos, whispered them like prayers. In a world obsessed with revenge, Grace Thompson had chosen something rarer, grace itself. And yet, her humility didn't erase the truth. Edward was finished. His arrogance had been recorded, his cruelty broadcast for all to see. His name, once synonymous with success, was now a case study in pride's collapse. Grace, on the other hand, became more than an artist. She became a symbol of strength, integrity, and the quiet power of truth. Her rediscovered paintings began to surface in galleries around the world. Collectors who had unknowingly purchased her stolen work came forward, some to apologize, others to celebrate her rebirth as an artist. Her first solo exhibition, titled What the Hands Remember, sold out before it opened. Critics called her work timeless, human, and transcendent. But Grace didn't let the fame change her. She still lived simply. She still painted quietly in her small studio, her window open to the hum of the city. And every time she finished a new piece, she would write her initials in the corner with the same calm care she had always given her craft. One evening, during a televised interview, the host asked her, "What do you want people to learn from your story?" Grace's hands rested in her lap. She looked into the camera, her eyes steady and kind. "That truth doesn't need to shout," she said. "It just needs to stand." The studio went silent again. Her calmness disarmed people. In a world addicted to anger and noise, she offered stillness, and that stillness became louder than any accusation. And yet, her story left people with a question that lingered long after the headlines faded. So pause for a moment, and imagine yourself standing in her place, humiliated in front of the world, mocked by the powerful, stripped of recognition, then handed the truth that could change everything. Would you reveal it? Would you hold the world accountable, or would you walk away in silence, letting peace weigh more than justice? Tell us in the comments below, what would you do if you were Grace Thompson? Because some truths don't just expose others, they reveal who we really are. The silence inside Edward Blackwell's penthouse was suffocating. The once bustling halls, filled with laughter, music, and the chatter of admirers, now echoed with emptiness. The golden chandeliers still hung overhead, but their light felt colder, harsher, no longer a symbol of power but of everything he had lost. For decades, Edward had lived untouchable, a man whose wealth could rewrite stories, whose charm could turn lies into truths. But now, that illusion had shattered. His name was smeared across headlines not as a symbol of success, but as a warning. Billionaire art mogul exposed for fraud. Edward Blackwell's empire under investigation. The fall of a titan. Every morning, new articles dug deeper, each one peeling back another layer of deception. His investors vanished overnight, his business partners refused his calls, and galleries rushed to erase his name from their records. His once loyal assistants resigned in silence. The world that had once worshipped him now recoiled at his shadow. He sat before the television, his reflection merging with the screen. There she was, Grace Thompson, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had underestimated, the woman whose quiet strength had brought him to his knees. Her voice flowed through the room, calm and measured, echoing from the speakers. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was simply herself, poised, serene, radiant with truth. On the screen, a journalist leaned toward her. "Grace," the interviewer asked, "do you forgive Edward Blackwell for what he did to you?" Grace smiled gently, her eyes steady. "Forgiveness is freedom," she said. "I gave my art to the world, not to him." Her words hung in the air, simple yet devastating. Edward turned the volume up, almost desperate. He needed to hear it again. Forgiveness is freedom. For the first time in his life, he didn't understand power. Forgiveness, something he had mocked his whole life as weakness, now stood before him like a mountain he couldn't climb. He lowered his head, his fingers gripping the glass of untouched scotch. The same hands that once signed deals worth millions now trembled slightly. The empire he'd built had vanished, but what stung worse was what remained, a hollow man, stripped of applause, with only his reflection for company. Outside, the city that once bore his name in golden letters on skyscrapers now carried whispers of his downfall. Former friends turned their backs. His mansion, once alive with guests, had become a mausoleum for pride. But Grace's life was moving in the opposite direction. Across town, she stood on a brightly lit stage, her silver hair catching the light, surrounded by her paintings, each one telling stories of hands that worked, hearts that endured, and souls that refused to break. The banner above her read, "Grace Thompson, The Hands That Served, a Retrospective." The crowd applauded as she stepped to the podium. She smiled, not with vanity, but with gratitude, the kind that comes from surviving storms that should have destroyed you. A young reporter raised his hand. "Miss Thompson," he asked, "what do you say to those who see you as the symbol of revenge against Edward Blackwell?" The room went quiet. Grace took a deep breath. "I don't see it as revenge," she said softly. "Revenge makes you look backward. I'm looking forward. I don't paint for revenge, I paint for truth." The audience erupted in applause, and somewhere in a dark apartment across the city, Edward watched, tears welling in his eyes. He didn't understand why he was crying. Was it guilt? Regret? Or the unbearable weight of seeing her at peace while he remained in torment? He remembered the laughter in the room that night, his laughter. The sound now made him sick. He had thought he was in control, thought he could belittle her without consequence. But her silence that night, her calm, that had been strength, not fear. He realized it too late. Grace's words, "Forgiveness is freedom," replayed in his mind like a refrain. The phrase spread like wildfire across the world. It became more than a quote. It became a movement. Artists began painting murals in her honor, her likeness beside the phrase written in bold letters. Students quoted her in essays. Teachers shared her story in classrooms. Women across the world used her words as armor, a testament that dignity could triumph over cruelty. Edward, once a man worshipped for his fortune, now lived in the shadow of a woman he had mocked for hers. He had chased immortality through money, she had achieved it through truth. Days turned into weeks. The investigators came and went. His art collections were seized, his accounts frozen, his penthouse stripped of its luxury. Yet none of that hurt him as much as hearing her voice again on another interview, speaking with that same serene wisdom. When asked what she would say if she ever saw him again, Grace paused. "I would tell him thank you," she said. "Because if he hadn't humiliated me, I might never have found my voice again." That was the final blow. He turned off the television, staring into the black screen, his reflection staring back, older, broken, alone. He whispered her words to himself, not mockingly this time, but with reverence. "Forgiveness is freedom." He realized he had lived enslaved all along, not by her, but by pride, greed, and the desperate need to be admired. The same chains he had used to control others had bound him tighter than anyone else. Meanwhile, Grace continued to live quietly, painting each morning in her modest studio. She didn't think of him often. She didn't need to. Forgiveness had already released her. She was free, and that freedom painted every new canvas she touched. And now, dear listener, pause for a moment. Ask yourself this: if you were in Grace's place, humiliated before the world, stripped of dignity, and then vindicated in the eyes of millions, would you forgive the person who hurt you? Would you rise above it as she did? Or would you let them drown in the same pain they gave you? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Because forgiveness might look easy from a distance, but when the wound is yours, it becomes the hardest art of all. Script 6, The Return to the Canvas, Narrative, 1,000 words. Months had passed since the night Grace Thompson's name was restored to the art world. The chaos of headlines had faded, and so had the noise of scandal. But in a quiet corner of the city, far from cameras, lights, and luxury, Grace found something far more valuable than fame: peace. Her studio, a small sunlit room with tall windows, was alive with color again. Morning light poured across unfinished canvases, glinting off glass jars filled with brushes, each one worn but loved. The air smelled of linseed oil and hope. Her hands, once cracked from years of scrubbing marble floors, now trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from creation. She painted every morning, losing herself in the rhythm that had once been stolen from her. This time, she wasn't painting for galleries, clients, or validation. She painted for truth, the same truth that had once lived quietly inside her, waiting to breathe again. Her new collection was called The Hands That Served. Each canvas told a story, not of the wealthy or the powerful, but of the unseen, the overlooked. One painting showed a nurse holding the hand of a dying man, exhaustion and compassion etched equally across her face. Another showed a janitor sweeping a museum hall beneath a painting he'd never be able to afford to see up close. One canvas captured a woman ironing a white shirt while a little boy slept beside her, her hand hovering midair in quiet fatigue and love. They were all tributes to those who built the world but were never seen in its spotlight. Museums called it her redemption era. Collectors called it revolutionary art. But Grace called it what it truly was, gratitude in color. Her daughter, now healthy and grown, often visited her in the studio. The young woman's laughter danced through the room as Grace worked, a melody of life reclaimed. "Mom," she said one morning, brushing her fingers across a drying canvas, "you've changed everything." Grace smiled softly, eyes still on her work. "No, love. I just remembered who I am." Outside her window, the world kept spinning, a world that had once looked down on her, now looking up in admiration. Invitations came daily, art schools wanting her to teach, international galleries requesting her exhibitions, magazines eager to tell her story. But she accepted only those that aligned with her message. She had no interest in glitter anymore. She had found gold in simplicity. Then one spring evening, Grace attended the grand opening of her collection's final showcase, a breathtaking gallery in the heart of the city. Every wall glowed with her work, every canvas pulsed with human warmth. Guests filled the hall, whispering in awe. Some recognized her immediately and approached her with reverence, but Grace remained humble, speaking softly, her hands clasped behind her back. To her, every compliment was not for her fame, but for the people her paintings represented. As she walked along the row of portraits, her heart swelled with quiet pride. She had painted life as it truly was, raw, flawed, beautiful. Then she felt it. That strange shift in the air. She turned, and saw him. Standing near the far wall, almost hidden among the crowd, was Edward Blackwell. Time had not been kind to him. His once perfect hair was grayer now, his confident posture replaced by something smaller, almost fragile. The arrogance that used to fill his presence had drained away, leaving behind only the faint outline of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. He stood still, staring at one of her paintings, a portrait of a woman kneeling to polish a floor, her reflection shimmering faintly in the marble beneath her. Above it, written in gold letters, was the title, The Hands That Served. Edward's eyes lingered on it longer than anyone else's. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in public, he looked human. Grace watched him quietly. Her heart did not race with anger. She felt no surge of satisfaction, no trace of revenge. Only a gentle, steady calm. As if sensing her gaze, Edward turned. Their eyes met across the room. For a long moment, the world seemed to fade, the lights, the voices, even the soft music in the background. They simply looked at each other. And in that silence, years of pain, pride, and misunderstanding dissolved. Edward's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened. He lowered his gaze, not in shame, but in recognition. He had once tried to own beauty, to buy it, to control it. Now, he stood before it and realized it could never be possessed. Grace's expression softened. She gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Not of forgiveness spoken, but forgiveness lived. He nodded back, eyes glistening. Then quietly, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Grace exhaled, her hand unconsciously brushing the edge of the canvas beside her. Forgiveness didn't always need words. Sometimes, silence spoke loud enough. Later that night, when the gallery emptied, Grace stood alone among her paintings. The hum of the city filtered through the glass walls, soft and distant. She walked from one painting to the next, touching each frame lightly, like saying goodnight to old friends. Her daughter entered quietly, slipping her arm through her mother's. "Mom," she whispered, "I saw him leave. Are you okay?" Grace smiled, her eyes warm. "Yes, my dear. Some goodbyes don't need to be spoken. They just happen." They stood together, watching the lights outside flicker against the night sky. Grace thought of all the hands she had painted, hands that had worked, cleaned, built, and healed. She thought of her own hands, aged and steady, and realized how far they had brought her. From scrubbing marble floors to signing museum walls, the journey hadn't been revenge. It had been resurrection. And forgiveness, she realized, wasn't something you gave for others. It was the brush that repainted your own soul. As they left the gallery, Grace turned back one last time. Her paintings glowed softly in the dim light, each one alive, breathing the stories of people like her. In that stillness, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for success, not for vengeance, but for understanding. Because even when life had stripped her of everything, her name, her art, her dignity, she had never lost her gift to see beauty in brokenness. And now, the world saw it too. Script 7, The Legacy of Grace, Narrative, 1,000 words. Years melted into time's quiet current, and what began as a moment of humiliation in a glittering penthouse became a story retold across generations. The world changed, but one name never faded: Grace Thompson. Her journey, once whispered in pity, had transformed into legend. Her name graced gallery walls, art schools, and scholarships for women who dared to dream after the world had told them not to. The Grace Thompson Foundation for Single Mothers in Art became a sanctuary of hope. Students who couldn't afford brushes or canvases now painted under her name, the name of a woman who had once been invisible. Everywhere she had once been unseen, her spirit now stood tall. The painting, the one that began it all, no longer hung in Edward Blackwell's penthouse. After years of litigation and public outcry, it was returned to its rightful creator. Now it hung in the National Museum of Fine Arts, encased in glass and illuminated by golden light. Beneath it, in letters that gleamed like quiet justice, were the words, "Grace Thompson, the woman behind the canvas." Visitors stood before it in reverent silence. Some came for the art, others for the story. Children whispered her name with awe, unaware that the woman behind that masterpiece had once scrubbed the floors of men who laughed at her. Couples took pictures, tourists marveled, art lovers cried. But few truly understood what they were looking at, not just a painting, but a life reclaimed. Grace's story became part of art history, not because of the scandal, but because of what she had done afterward. She never sought vengeance. She never chased wealth. Instead, she built a legacy rooted in dignity and compassion. In her later years, she moved to a small cottage by the sea. The walls were lined with her own paintings, waves breaking on the shore, hands holding hands, light filtering through open windows. Each canvas breathed peace. Children from nearby schools would visit every Saturday, gathering around her in that bright little studio. They came with wide eyes and messy sketchbooks, eager to learn. Grace, now in her 70s, would sit among them, her hands speckled with paint, her hair a crown of silver. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the same warmth it always had. "Your hands," she would tell them, holding up her own, "can create beauty even when the world refuses to see it. Don't wait for permission to be great." The children loved her, not because she was famous, but because she made them believe they could be too. Sometimes, parents would come to thank her. "You've changed my child's life," they'd say. Grace would only smile, dipping her brush into paint. "I didn't change it," she'd reply. "I just reminded them it was theirs to begin with." Meanwhile, around the world, her influence continued to ripple. Her words, "Forgiveness is freedom," became a phrase etched into classrooms, murals, and even the hearts of those who had never met her. She had lived by that truth until the very end. Even Edward Blackwell, whose downfall had once dominated headlines, found quiet redemption through her forgiveness. He never fully recovered his fortune or reputation, but years later, he donated what remained of his wealth to fund art programs for underprivileged youth, anonymously, though everyone knew who it was for. Some said it was guilt. Others said it was gratitude. Grace never commented. She didn't need to. She had already forgiven him long before. When the day came that Grace Thompson's heart finally rested, the world paused. News outlets across continents carried her story. Artists gathered in candlelit vigils. Students left brushes beside her museum portrait. One art critic wrote, "Grace Thompson didn't just paint canvases, she painted humanity back into art." Her funeral was simple, just as she had wished. No grand speeches, no lavish flowers. Only her daughter, a few close friends, and dozens of former students, all carrying something she had given them: courage. As the wind rustled through the churchyard trees, her daughter placed a paintbrush beside the headstone and whispered, "You turned pain into beauty, Mama." The world finally saw it. Years later, her story continued to echo, in classrooms, in documentaries, in hearts. Teachers spoke of her as more than an artist, as a testament to resilience. Her legacy became a compass for those who had been overlooked or silenced. And the painting, the one that had once brought her shame, became a beacon of triumph. School children on field trips stood before it, their teachers explaining how a maid once taught the world the true meaning of art. "She painted this?" one child would ask, wide-eyed. "Yes," the teacher would reply. "She painted it before anyone knew her name." But why didn't they know? "Because the world often mistakes silence for weakness," the teacher would say softly. But she proved that quiet strength can change everything. In the museum gift shop, visitors could buy prints of her painting, small replicas signed with the same initials, G. Thompson. Every sale contributed to scholarships in her name. Even in death, she continued to give. The world would go on to celebrate many artists, but none would capture hearts the way Grace had. Her art was not just beauty, it was truth carved out of struggle, painted with forgiveness. And as the decades passed, her life became legend, a story passed down like a sacred whisper, the maid who became a master, the woman who turned humiliation into heritage. One evening, long after her passing, an elderly museum curator walked into the gallery just before closing. He paused before her painting, the one that had started it all, and smiled. "You were right, Grace," he murmured. "Wealth can buy paintings, but never talent, heart, or truth." The lights dimmed, leaving only the painting aglow, the woman in the portrait gazing out with quiet strength, her eyes alive with timeless dignity. And in that moment, Grace Thompson lived again, not in fame, not in fortune, but in every person who dared to create, to forgive, to rise. The maid they once mocked had become the woman whose name defined Grace itself. And so, dear viewers, that is how a single moment of humiliation became the spark that lit a legacy. Grace Thompson's story reminds us that no amount of wealth or power can bury truth, it always finds its way back to the light. If this story moved you, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth, and subscribe to join us for more stories that touch the soul and remind the world what real humanity looks like. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and how would you have responded if you were in Grace's shoes that night? Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't anger or pride. It's becoming everything they said you could never be. Thank you for watching, and never forget, true grace doesn't shout. It simply stands, and changes everything.